Hello, welcome to the video about the Salem witch hunt of 1692 to 93, which is the third of our 3 case studies. Headlines. So, if you read some books, it says that over 200 were accused of witchcraft during this witch hunt. But if you look at some more detailed work, it usually uses the figure 156 because that's the official number of accusations that actually got into the court system. Now that was spread across 24 different communities around the Salem area in Massachusetts, but it's important to note that over half of these cases did originate in Salem village and in the nearby village of Andover, and we'll hopefully have some explanations for that a bit later on. The female stereotype of the witch held. It was 80% women, but a sizable number of men were accused as well. But the other stereotypes associated with the witch, elderly, living on the fringes of society, an outsider, not socially accepted, that broke down quite quickly, and anyone by the end of this could be accused, and that could be one of the reasons why the witch hunt itself suddenly began to decline later on. But we'll talk more about that as well. The colonists, even in their own lifetimes in Salem, began to admit that this had perhaps been a mistake, and compensation was being paid to the victims or the victims' families as early as 1697. But that was a bit too late for the 19 people that were executed, and the extra one that makes 20 who wasn't actually executed for witchcraft but was crushed to death for refusing to enter a plea because he thought that the whole thing was a sham. So he refused to say whether he was guilty or not guilty, and he was pressed to death under heavy stones. What a way to go. Now, if you're feeling a bit flat after that, I can tell you that in 1957, Massachusetts, the state of Massachusetts, did actually apologise formally, said that these trials had been a grave injustice, hundreds of years later they say this, and the result of hysteria and misunderstanding. Well, certainly a misunderstanding, but how far was hysteria a reason for this? Well, that's the million-dollar question, and we're going to be looking at some of the reasons for the witch hunt as we go along. Right, the first thing to understand is that Salem in Massachusetts was part of an area of North America settled mainly by English settlers and not surprisingly called New England. And the settlers in Massachusetts certainly were Puritan. They had disapproved of the religious situation in England. The church wasn't Protestant enough for them. They disapproved of the Church of England, not strict enough. So they thought, let's sail across to North America and create our own godly commonwealth, a very Puritan way of living. And Puritans, of course, had an apocalyptic worldview. We know that from the work we did on East Anglia in our second case study, and they took some of these ideas to New England with them. Now, if we look at this map, the area in grey is pretty much the area that we call New England. If you look, you've got Massachusetts in the middle of that. Just south of Massachusetts, you've got Connecticut as well. There weren't nearly as many cases of witchcraft in Connecticut as there were in Massachusetts, even before the events in Salem. And that's because Connecticut had been settled not by Puritans but by Anglicans, by moderate Protestants, Church of England Protestants. It does seem that witch persecution was more of a Puritan thing in New England, and of course Salem is a very Puritan area in Massachusetts, so there is a connection. Why? Right, so the connection between Puritanism and witch hunting could have some root in this apocalyptic worldview that we're going to summarize with this diagram. So it's this idea that the world is a battleground between good and evil, and obviously the Puritans are on the side of good, but if you don't fit in with their ideas of how you should live your life and worship, you are on the side of evil. And as part of this, the settlers, the colonists, think that the success of their colonies is part of this big battle between the forces of good and evil. Now, there are challenges and disasters and problems that they have to overcome, and so this is all being sent to test them. God tests them, or allows the forces of evil to test them. But ultimately, the Puritans have got this mission to create this godly commonwealth, and the first group of people that they demonize are the Native Americans, because they are not Christian, they're certainly not Puritan, and they are seen as these wicked pagans, these agents of the devil. They're on the side of the forces of evil. And of course, you're a Puritan, you feel threatened by this. And there is a real fear of the other, of external threats to the godly commonwealth. And this is something that isn't just from the Indians, actually, but really does condition the way Puritans think about the world. So they want to root out any threat to their godly society. Now, we know of a similar place where there was a similar apocalyptic worldview, and that was East Anglia in the Civil War era. And of course, Matthew Hopkins exploited that fear in the witch hunt of 1645 to 1647. So it's perhaps worth thinking about some of the parallels here. Okay, now if we look at the political situation in Massachusetts, when the Puritans had arrived sort of 50 years before, they'd had quite a lot of freedom. They were a long way from England, so they didn't get interfered with too much. So they set up a society in Massachusetts that was called the Charter Government, and this was a way of communities in some ways acting a bit like a theocracy. Now, what that means is like a religious society, but it's the idea that God is above everything else, that laws are seen as divine commands from God, that the law is important because it's God's will. And the clergy have a big role here. So Puritan ministers had a big role in society. It seems very important in society. And so the Puritans have this freedom, and they kind of get used to that. But then in 1684, this royal charter that had given them this freedom came to an end, and there was real uncertainty as to what England was going to do next. How much control would England want to put over its colonies? And they were right to be fearful, because in 1691 a new charter was drawn up, and what this meant was that the New England territories, Massachusetts, had to conform to English law. Now, why was this a problem? Well, they created this godly commonwealth. They hadn't had religious tolerance. You were a Puritan, or you were seen as wicked and evil. But the English law that they now had to follow was religiously tolerant. It allowed religious toleration. And the Puritans really didn't want to do that. But in 1691, they've got no choice. Now, they've got a particular fear of another group of Christians called Quakers. Now, you don't really need to know too much about what Quakers believed, but Puritans really didn't like them. Now, if you're a Puritan, you've already felt the threat from external enemies such as the Native Americans, but now they're also threatened after 1691 with what they would regard as alien religious forces, malevolent forces. Remember, they'd see these other types of Christians, Quakers, whoever, they would see them as perhaps on the side of the forces of evil. Now, we know this because the language the Puritans used at this time was quite telling. So there's a historian who writes a lot about Salem called Richard Godbeer, which is a brilliant name. And he wrote a book in 1992 called Devil's Dominion about New England and witchcraft. And in that book, he talks about the language the Puritans used. They described some of the officials that came over from England at this time. They described them as tools of the adversary. And remember, adversary is the name they used often to describe the devil. So they're using the same kind of language to describe non-Puritans with different religious beliefs as they did the Native Americans. They're putting them in this same group of evil threats to the godly commonwealth. Now, later on, when the Salem witch hunt gets underway, it's not quite as simple as saying that Quakers were accused of witchcraft in particular. That's not the case, but often um, in Salem village, the those that were accused had some connection to Quakers in the past, or some family connection, or they'd been friendly with Quakers. So it perhaps was reflected later on in the witch hunt itself. Okay, so we've already discussed that the main accusations, over half of the accusations, came from Salem village itself and the village of Andover. You can see on the map here roughly where they were. Important thing to realise is that Salem village was distinct from Salem town, and we're going to talk about why that was important, because that kind of reflected um, a lot of the tension that was in the village itself as well. Right, so the first thing to understand about Salem is this: there is a big difference between the village itself and the town. So the village, was quite a long way. Some of the villagers lived 10 miles from the centre of town. So the village is this rural farming settlement. It's not got any political power of its own. It's administered by the town. But it's less wealthy than the town, so that causes a bit of resentment. Um, they pay their taxes to the town. They provide food to the town, but the town then tells them what to do. Now you've got a combined community, village and town, of about 600, of which around 200 lived in the village. So the town's bigger. And the town makes the decisions that affect the villagers. So a good example of this is that you had a sort of early type of policing of what was called the night watch, and this was in the town, and the town required villagers to do their duty and take turns at coming to be night watchmen. And some of the villagers resented this because, it was a long walk into town, 10 miles for some of them. And they felt that, well, we never go into town normally. Why should we have to do this? So that was one example. The other example was to do with the church. The village in Salem wanted to be able to appoint its own Puritan ministers. It didn't want to be told what to do by the town all the time. So it didn't have its own church until the 1680s, 1689, I think. Now there was a family at the heart of this village town rivalry. They were called the Putnams. They lived in the village. They were one of the wealthier families in the village. They were farmers. They had conservative Puritan views. They didn't like change, and they actually thought that the village and the town should be separated from each other. And they chose to appoint a chap called Samuel Parris in 1689 as the minister of the Salem village church. Now, Samuel Parris and the Putnam family are often directly or indirectly involved in a lot of the accusations that are made later on in the witch hunt. Now, the Porters were another family in the village, but they advocated closer ties to the town. They're much more relaxed about the town, a bit more worldly in their view about things. And they tried to put a stop to the witch hunt. So there is some tension within the village, and there's tension between the village and the town itself. Now, why am I mentioning this? Is it a case of, if you liked the town, you were accused of being a witch? Well, it's not that simple, but there is some pattern here. Most of those that were accused in Salem village of being witches had quite close ties to the town. They tended to live on the eastern side of Salem village, so they were physically closer to the town, and they were often friends of the Porter family, or had the same kind of view as the Porter family, that the town wasn't a bad place, and that being connected to the town wasn't a bad thing. Now, those that accused them, the accusers, tended to live on the western side of Salem village, further away from the town. So there is perhaps an important pattern there, that this suspicion about the town and its worldly ways might lead some to think of it as being evil. as it being, too religiously tolerant and too worried about money and all the rest of it. So this kind of would have fed in the minds of some to that apocalyptic worldview about the forces of good and evil, and you're either in one or the other. More about Samuel Parris, more about the Putnams a bit later on. Okay, so against this background of tension in the village, and tensions between the village and the town, there's another problem bubbling away in the background, and that is this fear, this crisis mentality, which was caused by the fear of conflict with the Indians, with the Native Americans. Now, in 1689, there was a conflict called King William's War, where fighting between the English colonists and the Wabanaki Indians kicked off. Now, this was a big deal. It was a big deal because there had been conflict before. It died down for a bit, but in the 1670s there had been a big conflict that was still fresh in the minds of a lot of people, where the fighting men of Salem, those of a young age able to fight, 1 in 10 of them had been killed in these conflicts against the Indians. Men, women and children had died in the most horrible ways. There had been atrocities on all sides. The Indians were seen very much as devil worshippers in this Puritan worldview. Now, that had been in the 1670s, and then it all kicks off again in 1689, and that's just a couple of years, isn't it, before the Salem witch hunt. So this crisis mentality, this fear. Now, in the year before the witch hunt, 1692, the witch hunt starts, but 1691 to 1692, there are Native American raids in Massachusetts. In 1689, the neighbouring village of Andover had been raided, but in 1691-92, there's a lot of Native American raids on places in Massachusetts, and refugees start to arrive in Salem, and they arrive and they add to that fear of the other, of this external threat from the Indians. They add to that, they talk about massacres and horrors, and this helps to create in the village this fear, this impending dread and fear that trouble is coming their way, that it could be like it was in the 1670s. Now, that impending fear of war, that continual sense of threat, we've seen that somewhere before, haven't we? We've seen that in Würzburg, in the Holy Roman Empire. And although Würzburg didn't experience any direct fighting during the 30 Years' War, it was a fear that fighting was coming. And that helped to cause a witch hunt in Würzburg in the 1620s and 30s. Now, Würzburg's a different place, Catholic Prince Bishopric, all the rest of it. But this is a synoptic link because there's the same impending or fear of impending war and threat in Salem. And that makes people uneasy, and it makes people hyper-vigilant and perhaps more worried about the forces of evil and therefore witches. Right, so we know we had a crisis mentality in Salem and Massachusetts linked to the threat from the Native Americans. There was a high-profile case of witchcraft in Boston just a few years before the Salem witch trials, and that may well also have contributed to this sort of feeling of crisis or fear of witches as well. Now, there were laws in Massachusetts to deal with witchcraft. There was a belief in maleficia, but that wasn't enough to get the death penalty in Massachusetts. Maleficia on its own was not seen as serious enough. A witch to be punished by death had to have some diabolical link to a familiar spirit or a demonic imp. As a result of this, there was a belief in magic, there's a belief in witchcraft amongst the ordinary people, but there were only 61 cases from 1647 to 1697. That's not including Salem, obviously. Salem's, let's put that to one side. But there were only 61 cases and 16 executions. Now, that's against 156 cases in Salem in 1 year and 19 executions. So you can see that Salem really stood out. So it's not like there was a really strong tradition of witch hunting in Massachusetts or New England. Um, but what there was this high-profile case just a few years before in Boston. It's called the Goodwin case, and you can see here it gives you the basics of what happened. I won't read it out to you, but you can see that a Puritan minister called Cotton Mather gets involved in this, and he sees these children in pain, flapping their arms like birds, and he says there's no natural cause for this, they've been bewitched. And who gets blamed for this? An outsider who absolutely ticks all the stereotypical boxes for a witch at this point. She's an elderly washerwoman, she's not a Puritan, she's a Catholic, she doesn't even speak English, she speaks Gaelic. She is found guilty. Somehow she is believed to be caught up in a diabolical activity. She's not just a witch performing harmful magic. She's got a link to the forces of evil and the devil. And she's found guilty and she's hanged, the poor old girl. Now this got a lot of publicity at the time because Cotton Mather actually wrote a book about it. Now this is a book that would be read by the elites in Salem, and he is a Puritan minister. Remember, they were highly respected, and it's possible, isn't it, that this would be fresh in the memory of people just a couple of years later when the witch hunts in Salem begin. Okay, so we're going to look now at the key events of the witch hunt, and we're going to touch upon some other possible causes for it. Right, so it all begins in January 1692, and it begins in the household of Samuel Parris. Remember him? He's that Puritan minister appointed to the village church in 1689 by the Putnam family. So his daughter, 9 years old, and his niece, 11 years old, start experiencing strange fits, thrashing about, contorting their bodies into strange positions, and they're complaining of being pinched and pricked by sort of invisible forces. Now Parris calls in the local doctor, Dr. William Griggs, and he comes in and says, "Oh, yes, they are bewitched, they are bewitched." And at first Parris, like a good Puritan minister, says, yes, more prayer is needed and perhaps fasting. Let's live a morally pure religious life. Now, whilst all of this is going on, the girls are visited by other girls in the village, all of whom are connected to the Putnam household in some way or another. So Anne Putnam, the Putnam's daughter, Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, Elizabeth Hubbard, they all know each other, and as we're going to see later, they are all connected to the Putnams as well as to the Parris household. They come along and see this going on, and we'll see what happens later. Okay, so what I want to do now is zoom in a bit on Samuel Parris, the man whose house this began in, because I think that as an individual, his role in the witch hunt should be explored, because he was a very strong Puritan. He's this minister that's been appointed by the Putnams, remember. He's got this very apocalyptic worldview, which I imagine rubbed off on the girls themselves. He talked in terms of good and evil. The Puritan church, Salem, Massachusetts, all under attack from the forces of evil. Now he's a difficult man. He's a complex character. He's a failed merchant. He's got a bit of a chip on his shoulder. He's got very difficult relations with some people in the town. Now, that could be because he was a failed merchant himself and perhaps resented the commercial success of the town. He's been appointed by the Putnams. He's an ally of the Putnams. And it's possible he fell out with the Porters because the Porters ended up, the Porter faction, this is, the supporters of the Porter family, ended up, and the Porters themselves ended up coming into conflict with Samuel Parris. He wanted a bigger salary to be paid to him for being the minister of the village. He'd spent quite a lot of money on some new candlesticks for the village church. Now, this had not gone down well with what was called the rate committee. Remember, the town controlled the village. Now, in the town, there was something called the rate committee, which decided what salary Samuel Parris would be paid and decided how much he could spend. Now, he was criticised by the rate committee for buying these candlesticks, and he was really worried that the rate committee were going to try and cut his salary. And the rate committee was controlled by the Porters, who were the opponents, if you like, of the Putnams, who had supported and appointed Samuel Parris in the first place. Now, he identifies the town as wicked, as do his supporters, as do the people in his household. It's likely he also sees anybody that supports the Porters as wicked. And remember, he's got this worldview, like a lot of Puritans: you're either with us or against us. His enemies, in his mind, were evil. So that's an attitude, isn't it, that would create an interesting dynamic in that house. Okay, the other key person in the Parris household, where the accusations begin, is his Caribbean slave, Tituba. Now, we don't know much about her ancestry, but she was not Native American or African, or actually perhaps a mixture of the two. She had a reputation in the village for knowing some kind of magic, perhaps voodoo, something like that. Certainly, some historians think that she had been involved with the young girls in the village in trying to help them see the future. Who are you going to marry? Are you going to marry your sweetheart? Blah, 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 blah. By suspending an egg in water and seeing how it floats, and doing other sort of weird and wonderful things to try and see the future. So she's got this reputation. She's an outsider. She's certainly not a Puritan, is she? She's not regarded as the same as everyone else. She looks different. She's got this different background. Now, when the girls in the Parris household start complaining of their symptoms, a neighbour asks Tituba to make a witch cake. That's a sort of a way of protecting the girls. But this reputation for magic that Tituba has actually makes her a bit of a suspect quite early on. Now, in the following month, Parris changes his view on what's happening here. He tells the girls to stop praying and fasting, and instead he starts to think that they are being hurt by an outside force, by witches perhaps, and he encourages them to name their tormentors. And so they do, and they name 3 women in the village who are all seen as social outsiders. One of them is Tituba. And that kind of feeds into the idea that maybe these girls were feeling guilty about something they'd done, some fortune telling they'd done with Tituba, and this was a way of sort of putting the blame onto her. That's a possibility, but we don't know. And then the other 2, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, they were social outsiders. So those 3 women are arrested, and there's a meeting in the village hall. At first it was in the village inn, but it wasn't big enough, so they went to the village hall. And these girls, who are acting as if they're possessed by sort of evil spirits, they give evidence against these 3 women. And they say that these 3 women are witches, and they have come to them in the night, or their spectres, their spirits have come to them in the night, and forced them to sign the devil's book, so that the devil is mentioned. And that this is what's causing the fits they're suffering from. It's these spectres that are pinching them and hurting them. Now, Sarah Good is a beggar in the village. She's really looked down upon straight away, and perhaps because she's scared, I don't know, she's trying to get herself out of trouble. She says, yes, Sarah Osborne's the one that's been doing it. She's the one that's been harming the girls, and drops her fellow suspect in it. Now, Tituba, who knows why? She might have been panicking. She might be scared. Who knows? She says, "Yes, I am a witch. Yes, right. I'm a witch." And she also confirms that Sarah Good is a witch, and she says Sarah Osborne's a witch as well. Not only that, Tituba adds to this and says there's a devil's conspiracy in Massachusetts. Now, why would she confess to this? Well, you know, she wasn't a witch, and we know there wasn't a devil's conspiracy in Massachusetts. Is she saying what she thinks people want to hear? She's a slave. She's in a situation. She's vulnerable. She's in a household where the devil is talked about a lot. Is she just saying what she thinks they want to hear. Is she being put under pressure by Samuel Parris, her owner? Who knows? But this is what happens. This is what happens at the meeting. And then other villagers start to come forward, and they come forward not so much with stuff about the devil, but accusations of maleficium. And these three women are being accused of doing harmful magic by these other villagers, and they're locked in jail, where conditions are really awful, really harsh. I mean, being locked up was a bad enough punishment. Now, the girls in the Parris household are visited by their friends, and all of their friends, and they're listed here, I'm not going to read through every one of them, all of their friends become accusers. This starts to spread. It's worth noting this down. It's worth noticing how each of the accusers that drove the early part of the witch hunt were linked to the Parris household or to the Putnam household. And it's quite interesting to see that one of the older girls, Mercy Lewis, she links also to this crisis mentality directly, actually, because she was a refugee from some of these Indian attacks. So have a look at this, and just as we go through this, make a note of it, and then think, well, what of those pressures we've been thinking about, those earlier background causes, what would have influenced some of these girls, perhaps? All right, so back to the key events in the witch hunt. So by March, there's new charges. So Anne Putnam Jr., she was on the list we just saw. She lives in the Putnam household. She's Anne Putnam Jr. because her mother's also called Anne Putnam, just to confuse everyone. She claims to have been afflicted by the spectral forms of two other villagers, Martha Corey and Rebecca Nurse. Abigail Williams supports this, and Anne Putnam's mother, Anne Putnam Sr., also supports this. So the Putnam household very much now at the centre of this. Now, why these two? Well, Martha Corey they were both very respected, these women. Martha Corey had been sceptical openly in the village about the girls, sort of saying, well, I don't believe any of this. Rebecca Nurse had a long-standing dispute with the Putnams. She was more allied to the Porter faction in the village. Now, both women were not social outsiders. They were upstanding members of the village community. So very quickly, the stereotype is starting to break down. They are also locked in jail very quickly. And remember, the conditions are really harsh. Now, from March to April, there's more and more accusations. It's the girls driving most of these. Sarah Cloyce is the sister of Rebecca Nurse. She's accused after they suffer fits. Why do they accuse Cloyce? Well, because Cloyce has been going around the village as well, saying, this is madness. My sister Rebecca Nurse, she's not a witch. So if you defended some of the accused, you're perhaps making yourself vulnerable of being accused yourself. Now, the girls are exhibiting these symptoms in public, suddenly going into these fits and all the rest of it, and pointing their fingers and saying such and such is hurting me and pinching me, and this is they're doing it in quite a convincing way. Now, it starts to pick up even more momentum by May. The girls start accusing people of witchcraft in Andover, which is outside of Salem village. Now, they get taken to Andover. They actually get taken there, and they are used almost like witch finders. They went to Andover, they named people in Andover, and then those people were arrested. So by the end of May, 62 people are in these dreadful conditions in jail. There's a 5-year-old child in jail. Conditions are awful. Now, Abigail Hobbs is accused. She confesses to being in league with the devil. She becomes an informer, and she starts accusing other people. Now, why would she confess? A lot of those that confessed could avoid being executed. So we think that's what drove a lot of these women to actually confess. Mary Warren, Deliverance Hobbs are accused. They confess, and they say there's a conspiracy of over 300 witches in Salem, where they fly to all their meetings. Now, you start to get a bit of a chain reaction going on here, because you've got people being accused of witchcraft denouncing others and saying, yes, they're also part of this conspiracy. So in that respect, it's a little bit like some of the chain reaction hunts in Europe at the time. If you're locked in this jail, by the way, conditions are so bad, you might confess just in the hope of getting out of jail, avoiding the death penalty and getting out of jail. Now, from June to September, this is when it starts to get a lot more official interest here. The governor of Massachusetts is a man called William Phips. He's been sent over from England. And he gets involved at this point, and he sets up what's called the Court of Oyer and Terminer to hear and determine these cases. So you've got all of these mainly women in jail, and the Court of Oyer and Terminer meets 5 times, and each time it meets, it determines whether there's enough evidence to proceed to a trial. And if there's a trial, a grand jury is called, and the defendant goes on trial. Now, Phips puts in charge of this a man called William Stoughton, who is, it seems, really fanatically determined to root out witches. In one of the earliest cases, where the jury found an accused witch not guilty, he sent them back to reconsider their verdict. So this is a guy determined to get guilty verdicts. Now, in these cases, the accused are having to defend themselves. They don't have legal representation, so they're going up against judges, and they're having to defend themselves, which puts them at a disadvantage. They don't necessarily know the law. They're not as learned as people like Stoughton. Now, the other thing about these courts is that the petitions from neighbours that say, no, they'd never do this, they're of good character, were often ignored. And gossip instead was accepted as evidence. Now, even from quite early on, there were some people who were not very happy with the way these courts were running. Now, one of the judges was called Nathaniel Saltonstall, a very Puritan judge, but he resigned quite early on after the first execution was made. Remember, there were 19 executions. After the first one was made, he quit because he said, I don't want to be part of these proceedings. Now, part of the sort of worry about these proceedings, apart from the things listed there, is that the courts were accepting something called spectral evidence. Remember, the girls were talking about being hurt by the spirits or spectres sent by people. Now, this wasn't something that was particularly reliable, but the court accepted this idea. Now, in Puritan theology, it was believed that human beings could not send their spirits to hurt other people. What the Puritans believed is that only demons and the devil could do that. But they could only send a spectre of a person with that person's permission. So straight away, if you're saying that person sent a spirit or a spectre, what you're actually saying is the devil sent it, but with the permission of that person, which straight away makes it serious, doesn't it? The devil is involved in this. The human being can't do it themselves. The devil has to do it for them with their permission. And the court is accepting this spectral evidence. These girls are thrashing their arms around and convincing me, oh, it's hurting me, she's hurting me. Very hard to defend yourself against that, isn't it? How do you say, no, I'm not doing any of this, if the court is accepting this kind of evidence? So by September 1692, things are getting really out of hand by this point. 19 people have been executed, but the number of people being accused is growing and growing and growing. And even the wife of Governor William Phips, remember, he's the governor of Massachusetts, the elite of the elite, his wife is now being accused of being a witch. This accusation spiraling out of control now, driven in part by the girls, driven by other people. It's getting really out of hand. Now, remember we talked about spectral evidence being accepted by the court. Remember, Puritans said human beings could not manifest as spectres. Only demons or the devil could do that, and they needed the permission of the person to do it. Well, Increase Mather, who is the father of Cotton Mather, who was the guy who wrote the book about the Boston case. Increase Mather, very well respected. He pops up with a view about what's going on in Salem. And he says, yeah, I've got some doubts about this whole spectral evidence thing that the court is accepting. I don't think the court should accept this, because let's remember, the devil, he is the ultimate liar. He's the father of lies, the ultimate deceiver. So perhaps he's deceiving us deliberately by sending the spectres of people who are innocent to trick us, to fool us, to get those innocent people into trouble, because that's what the devil does. He's the ultimate deceiver. And so the idea of spectral evidence is criticised. Not everybody had agreed with spectral evidence in the first place, but it's now coming under a bit more attack. Now, to add to this, a lot of the people who had confessed earlier on to being witches were starting to recant, to withdraw their confession, and they're saying, the only reason I confessed is because I was told it was the only way I could avoid execution. The only reason I confessed is I was put under psychological pressure. The only reason I confessed is because I was put under physical pressure. I mean, being locked in that jail was pressure enough for a lot of, especially the elderly or the young, the very young. So you've got people withdrawing their confessions. You've got this attack on the idea of spectral evidence. You've got the fact that the wife of the Governor General has now been accused. These all help to undermine confidence in what the court is doing. And by October 1692, Governor Phipps, not surprisingly, probably to keep his wife happy, shuts the whole thing down and ends the trial. Now, a lot of people are against this because there is still this belief in witches. And you could still believe in witchcraft, but still be an opponent of what the court was doing, because it's this judicial skepticism, isn't it? The court isn't perhaps doing a good enough job. Perhaps the court is convicting innocent people. You could still believe in witches and hold that view. I'm just going to end here with a list of the resources used, and I invite you to read some of these yourself.